The final thing I wanted to share with you guys was how to manage cutting decent sizes of fabric in a small space. And I have a little over a yard of fabric here that I'm going to make a binding out of. So this is a yard of fabric just cut off the bolt. And you can see that my mat here is 11 inches by 17 inches. And that is far too small to have this fabric wide open to cut. The easiest way to cut large pieces of fabric is to buy a larger cutting mat and bigger rulers. You will be able to move through fabric much more quickly, but it's not necessarily an accuracy issue. You can cut fabric very accurately with small rulers and a smaller mat. It just takes a little bit more time. So I have my fabric here, and you can see there are some creases in it from where it was folded during shipping and storage on my shelves. So I'm gonna take a moment to press this fabric so that we start with a nice clean slate. So I have my fabric all pressed and it's nice and flat, but it's still too big for our mat here. So we need to make the fabric fit the size of the mat that we have. So I'm gonna take this fold line from the bolt and I'm gonna bring it up and match it to the line where the selvage turns into the print, that print line. Now you could use the edge of the selvage, but it's just easier to see that line. So that's what I use. And I'm going to stick a pin in here actually, because I'm gonna need to move this fabric down and slide it so that I can continue matching that fold up to the print line. And I don't want to shift what I've already matched up. Now you can see from these edges that this cut line does not match up with the cut line here. It could be that the fabric was just a little bit distorted as it was rolled off the bolt, or it could be that they moved the ruler a little bit when they cut it, but I don't want you to worry so much about this cut line because the cut line could be inaccurate. What we're more concerned about is this fold here and this fold here. We want them to be parallel. So here's an example. Here's a piece of paper and we're gonna fold it once. This is how fabric comes off the bolt. These are the selvages. And then we are folding it again. And we want this line and this line to be parallel. If they are not, let's say it's a little bit of an angle, then when we make our cuts on our fabric, when we open it up, that line is not going to be straight. This piece of fabric, if you're using it for a binding, it's not going to be straight. See how this dips in and then dips back out? So in the middle here, see, there's no way to align that to a straight line. So this isn't a real usable piece of fabric. But if we fold this so that these lines are really parallel, and I'm going to have a tough time now that I folded it so many times, so that this fold line and this fold line are parallel. Now when we cut it, you end up with a nice straight piece of fabric. See how this one follows a line on the mat, whereas this one is kind of like a zigzag? So when we fold our fabric, we want to make sure that these lines are parallel, and that's why we're taking the time to pin them as we progress, so we're not distorting the fold as we go. Now I'm going to take a moment and press this fabric again, because I want this fold to be nice and flat so that I can use my reference marks on my mat to make sure it is parallel to this line. So now that we have this all nice and flat and pressed, we can align this fold to a line on the mat. And you want to just make sure it's nice and straight. And now we can double check that our lines up here are nice and parallel. And they look really good. So I'm going to grab a ruler and we're going to make some slices. Now I cut my fabric with the lines on the mat. And I know that a lot of people prefer to cut their fabric using only the lines on the ruler. You can do whatever system you prefer. If you like to work with the lines on the ruler, then you'll probably prefer to start at the other end of the fabric here so that you can move your ruler along the line of the fabric. I prefer to work right to left because that's the way that I've always done it. And it's difficult to change. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to remove this pin so my ruler stays flat. The first thing we're going to do is just clean up this edge. And this edge is wavy just because that's how it was cut when it came off the bolt. Now that we have a nice clean line here, we can start measuring over and cutting. So I'm going to cut a couple of 2.5 inch strips and then we'll move our fabric over. Oh, and I need to move my pin again. I want to make sure my ruler stays flat. Now when I am measuring with my ruler, I am not aligning the edge with this line on the mat. I'm looking at the lines that are here inside the ruler and the lines on the mat under the ruler because there's a little bit of distortion on this edge. So I'm looking at like this line of long dashes and this 1/2 inch line, and that's what I'm using. You can also slide your ruler around and use one of the horizontal lines on the ruler to square it with the lines on the mat here. And then I hold it down. And when you're holding it down, if you put your pinky on the edge of the ruler, like on the fabric to kind of hold the ruler in place, then it'll help prevent your ruler from slipping. And there we go. Here are our binding strips. And they look really good. They look nice and straight. There's no V-ing at the cut. If I were to continue to want to cut binding strips from this, I would just take this piece of fabric, pull it over, make sure it's nice and flat, and then align this bottom edge again with a line on the mat. So once I had this all moved over, I would take the time to just go ahead and reestablish a nice straight cut line. You can see just in moving this fabric over, the edges are already not aligned from where we just cut them. So I would make sure it was just barely over one of the lines, and then I would slice off this little tiny bit. It's a small adjustment, but when you are sewing together, say, 100 4-inch squares, if some of them are off 1/8 of an inch, it's really going to throw off all of your seam lines. So being really accurate when you're cutting really does make a difference. Now there are limitations to a mat and a ruler size. If you were to fold this fabric again to get it down even a smaller mat, then you'd be cutting through 8 layers of fabric, and that's a lot. Even with a really sharp blade, you're bound to have some miscuts. So this is about as small as I would really recommend you go when you are folding to cut on a smaller mat. And the other limitation is if you need a 14.5 inch square from a piece of fabric, then you really need a mat that is at least that big, or you're going to have a lot of guessing as to using a ruler, or you're going to be stuck using a ruler and marking a line and then shoving it back onto your mat and trying to cut it. I would say buying a larger cutting mat is really a really good investment to make in your quilting life. So mine is gigantic and I cut yardage off the bolt all the time, but you could get by with, let's see, 18 by 24 is a really common cutting mat size, and that will get you just about anything you need. You can even cut fabric off the bolt on that. You can cut strips all, stop clacking your nails on the ruler.